I think all of us in all different situations have some level of power. That power may be very, very small. Like, I don't know, if you're just your first job and you're working at a fast food restaurant and your boss is just a jerk, what power do you have? Well, you can actually leave. That's a power, not much power, but it's but always considering the situation and looking for what you're trying to accomplish, and then ask yourself, what are the things you could do to try to get closer to your goal? You may not get there one step. Start from there and try to override a little bit sometimes the emotion of a situation where maybe you're being really put down or actively worked against through prejudice or outright discrimination or all different things can be in play. But I think I found that that's the best way to generally move forward is to always be thinking about caring for yourself and thinking about what small act of rebellion can you do to move a step forward in the face of a great challenge.
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready? Today's guest is Debbie Ferguson. Debbie is, at her core, a builder. She spent the first 35 years of her career in technology, coaching and developing people as she helped to build widely used software applications and world-changing companies. In August 2023, she retired from technology to develop her writing craft in order to build stories that will hopefully inspire readers and grow empathy and understanding. Along her journey, she has also become a private pilot, a scuba diver, and a pole dancer. Very intriguing, Debbie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Heather. I'm so glad to be here and thrilled to be doing this with you.
Yeah, it's exciting. So I met you as part of this writing journey that you're on. We were both at a writing workshop, and many aren't going to know you as they listen to this podcast, but I think I was really struck by just how warm you were. I am sort of naturally an introverted person, and as we were at this workshop, I just felt really drawn to you. And that very first day, I remember you and I had a conversation, and then I was like sort of imprinted on you for all eternity, Debbie. So
Oh,
we
you're
will
so
forever
kind.
be.
I actually remember you being very warm. I would not guess that you were an introvert. I
Oh,
immediately felt connected, and so we're having a great conversation. So thank you, Heather.
yeah, very meaningful. And I think that's the key about the relationship we're building is that we always have such great conversations. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have today and be able to share that with
So
everyone.
am I.
Now, I'm going to jump right in, Debbie, because I think we're going to have a
Let's do
lot to
it.
talk about.
Yeah.
Small Acts of Rebellion is about self-advocacy, about moments of reclaiming or stating our power, sometimes in small ways and sometimes in really bold ways, reflecting on your own journey, especially in tech. I'd love to hear about a time when you experienced the importance of recognizing and using your own power.
Sure. And by the way, I love the name of your podcast, and I think big rebellions start with small steps and small acts. And so you can't have a big thing, make a big change without lots of little changes. So I just love the theme. To answer your
100%.
question, I think back to my time when I was at Facebook leading a pretty big organization there. And Facebook had a pretty difficult, a challenging, set high standards for folks. And so I had one cycle, performance review cycle, where I got a rating that was below meets. It was the first time in my then 30-year career I'd ever not met or exceeded expectations. It was a little bit of a blow to my ego. I didn't totally agree with the rating, but I also thought, well, I can see, okay, it's high standards, so I'll roll with it. But what I wanted to do was to figure out right away, what can I change so this doesn't occur, because it was a surprise. And that immediately goes to thinking about, well, what control do I have in that situation? And one of the things I thought of is I can reset expectations, make them very clear and documented, essentially create a contract with my manager about what the next half will be. And if I do these things, I will be successful again. And so I wrote it up. I gave it to my manager. He said he wanted to review it with our head of product and our great boss, I think you might call them. And I came back a few days later and said, hey, this is exactly right. If you did these things, you would be exceeding expectations. So great there. And by the way, our great boss doesn't want you on the team, even if you do all those things successfully, which that's a pretty big blow. I'm someone who really struggles with or not being accepted. Like I want to do anything to be accepted. And so this is like a person who's been with the founder with Mark Zuckerberg since the very beginning at Harvard. What do I do about this? Now I'm in a place where no matter what I do, I could lose my role. But I also had a thought that this is not legally legit. Like you can't actually say someone's meeting job expectations and then say you're still off. Like that seems to violate the principles there. So I figured I would look at what are the ways I can get my power back? Because I'm in a place of losing power. And I thought about, well, I could go ballistic, I could rage quit, I could hire some lawyers and go after the company. I could also talk to this great boss. And one of the things Facebook pitched at the time or promoted was this notion of having hard conversations with each other. Regularly, Sheryl Sandberg would say to the whole company, have you had a crucial conversation recently? So I decided I would go that route. I would try to understand what's driving, maybe there's a misunderstanding here. And that was maybe some way I could find a way to get back into having an opportunity to keep my role, which I really liked. And I went to HR, and the HR person said, yes, you can do this, but Great Boss doesn't like conflict. So I don't recommend doing it. So I was like, I mean, what? Like the company promotes this. This is what it's about. I'm not going into like yell at them. I just want to understand and be like, I heard this. This is how I perceived it. And then here's my judgment about it. What do you say? And then we can clear the air. And HR was like, no, you just, no, I don't recommend, don't do that. That will not end well. So then my power is getting more and more diminished. But I did point out, like, look, I don't think one of the things I'd done right after I got this feedback from my manager was to write it back to them. Hey, look, this is what I heard you say, that even if I do my job, I will not be able to keep my job. And I wanted that in writing. And they replied and gave it to me in writing. Yes, that's exactly what he said. So I showed this to HR and they realized they had a problem here. And so ultimately, what they came back to as a compromise was what role in the company that's open are you interested in? We will put you in that role. So was that ideally what I hoped for? No. But it's a case where I felt like I started with very little control in my situation. I still cared about Facebook overall as a company and their interests. And what did I want to accomplish in my job at this company that was rapidly growing? I love to build and develop leaders. And in a rapidly growing company, there's great opportunities. I didn't want to lose that opportunity. And so I used that little piece of power that I had at that moment to get into a new role where I could continue to do the things I liked, continue to contribute to Facebook, and ultimately got back on track to good expectations, even though I was in this place. And I think all of us in all different situations have some level of power. That power may be very, very small. Like, I don't know, if you're just your first job and you're working at a fast food restaurant and your boss is just a jerk, what power do you have? Well, you can actually leave. That's a power, not much power, but always considering the situation and looking for what you're trying to accomplish, and then ask yourself, what are the things you could do to try to get closer to your goal? You may not get there one step. Start from there and try to override a little bit sometimes the emotion of a situation where maybe you're being really put down or actively worked against through prejudice or outright discrimination or all different things can be in play. But I think I found that that's the best way to generally move forward is to always be thinking about caring for yourself and thinking about what small act of rebellion can you do to move a step forward in the face of a great challenge.
Now, Debbie, I know you've coached a lot of folks over the years, and there were a few things that you said that I'm hoping that you maybe can help guide people who are earlier in their career. And so, one of the things that you mentioned in your story was that you took the time to say, like, if I did X, Y, and Z, would I be able to get a better rating? And I think a lot of people, in my experience, don't put enough effort in things like one-on-ones and annual reviews, quarterly reviews, whatever frequency they're having with their leadership. And I don't think it's a lack of desire. I just think it's a lack of, understanding the importance of taking the time and then also knowing how to do it well. And so could you just talk, I guess, more tactically about some recommendations in that respect?
One of the things that I've often told folks throughout my coaching sessions, especially with folks early in their career, is it's so important to try to get to a as crisp an agreement on expectations as possible, particularly in a new role where you just don't know. Like maybe you come out of college and you're a straight A student and you were straight A in high school and you just never, yeah, you've been able to work hard and every time you worked hard, you got good ratings. Well, now you're in a, maybe you're at a place where lots of people are like that. And so if there's some type of curve on evaluation, you might get average. But how is that decided? That's unclear unless you write down, like what I always say is write down what you think is expected for your role plus one. Discuss that with your manager and see if you agree that that's because if you then work towards that and miss it by a little, you're still greatly exceeding or surpassing the expectations for your role. You're in a really safe place. You've taken your power and done something that also helps your manager. Because at the end of a period, you have a written version of what was said and what was agreed to. And so it's easier for your manager now to write the review. I'm not saying all managers will be very good at this. I've had a manager in my own career, even at a later level, who said, yeah, I don't know if that's exactly right. It's like, well, let's just say, here's what my expectations are. And so please correct me if they aren't right. Otherwise, I'm gonna operate this way. And then it's just gonna be more painful for all of us if it gets to the end. And I know I talk from a tech industry perspective, but I also did work for a while at a grocery store and I worked in different roles. And it works in different ways. But even when I was like uh bagging groceries at the grocery store, I could still have a conversation with managers saying, here's what I hope to get done every day. Is that what you're hoping from me? Is that what will help me to get a promotion or get a raise?
Another thing I think is really impactful about your story, Debbie, is that you were in a what could have been a really emotional situation, but you had clarity to stop, clarify, document your perception and take all these steps. And I think sometimes when we're kind of in our feelings, it can be hard to see clearly. I think you also had the benefit of having some like life and career experience. So for people who maybe are earlier in their career and need some tips to kind of remain calm in that type of situation, do you have any recommendations?
First, I was emotional. The question is, what was I going to do with those emotions? Like, yeah, I was hurt. I'd never in my career had someone say that they didn't want me on their team. That goes like a core fear is that that I'm rejected, like a very primal, primitive fear. And that was there. I was upset. I was angry. I cried. So I didn't deny those emotions, but I did try to separate a bit. Okay, this is how I'm feeling. Okay, now it's a little bit of my engineer in me, my problem solving. Okay, as much as I can, I wrote it down. Account what are my options for solving this problem, which is what it was, and then try to assess them. What am I trying to accomplish? What do I want? I want to coach people. I want to build products. This is a great place to do it still. Lots of great people here. I'm running into one barrier. So if there's a way to work around that barrier, but the emotions were still there. I just had to be mindful of when fear was driving the car or when the emotions were really running high. And then take a deep breath. Okay, accept the emotion and then go back to thinking about it separately. So it's not easy, but I would never recommend suppress the emotions. The emotions are real. And if you understand where they're coming from, it helps in deciding what you want to do about it. Like I definitely even knew I knew at that time from lots of therapy work that me being rejected is the one thing is one of those deep things that really hits me hard and hurts deep and keeps me awake at night. And I knew that was in play here. And so I was like, okay, this is really hitting my core. All right. That I can't change right now. What can I do with the situation?
I can really relate with that sense of concern over rejection. Growing up blue collar and moving into a white collar profession, I think there was always a part of myself where I thought, you know, maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe they're going to figure out that I'm not one of them. And so sometimes that chip on my shoulder was a really great way to motivate me to work hard and to outmaneuver people and, you know, to do what needed to get done to be successful. But I also think that there were times when my mental health wasn't as strong, and that same chip that I was carrying on my shoulder started to be more like an anchor that was weighing me down. And so I think it's important to acknowledge those emotions. It's so imperative that you can get control over them. And when you aren't in like control of them, in the sense that you're not recognizing them, you're not giving them the space they need to process that sort of thing. I think that's the point where you have to stop. And I didn't stop. I got real close to the edge of, some really just bad like mental state, and it was really taxing, right? I was leading into burnout. I was close to depression. So I guess this is my PSA to say, like, if you are, struggling with those feelings, recognize when you're in control of them and when you're sort of, and I hate to say even in control, but when you recognize them and they seem manageable versus when they're no longer manageable and they seem to be spinning out. Because I do think, Debbie, in a situation like the one you described, if I were in that sort of darker place, I'd have a much harder time sort of breaking it down, thinking rationally, taking the right steps to avoid tripping myself up in my career and showing up in a way that I don't really want to show up, right? I mean, there are times that when we sort of flip to the extreme, we show up in ways that don't feel authentic to ourselves.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like when I was talking to the HR person, I lost it completely. Not only did I cry, which is the worst when you're crying at work, at least I find that just, it feels humiliating. And then I also may have used a bit of language when I discovered that Great Boss wasn't interested in doing the thing the company professed. That's I was uncontrolled anger at that moment. Another thing that I think can help is having a sounding board. That can be like gold is if you have a mentor, like someone who you trust, who isn't in your line of command, who is willing to reflect on what you're thinking about doing and isn't afraid to tell you, I think you're letting some of your emotion get in you. Like, 'cause it's hard to see it in yourself. And that alternate is a really close friend that is willing to give you bad news, not just the friend who always gives you the positive thing. Oh yeah, that's exactly what you should do, no matter what you say. That's not helpful. Or if you can afford a professional counselor who can really understand, is trained in spotting emotions and how they're playing into your actions.
I think this is a good segue, Debbie, because we just talked about barriers within the workplace, people barriers. But there are other types of barriers, and one that I think is really unique to you. And so you learned to fly, which is a really unique skill. I would love to know what motivated you to take on this challenge.
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. So the story is that years ago, I got really frustrated at the company I was at, and I decided at the time I was done with the company, I was gonna start my own company. So it's an example, although I wouldn't have described it this way, it was an example of how do I get control back of the situation here. I started a company in my hometown, and the reason I needed to be in that hometown near Sacramento was my father-in-law was having health issues, and as a family, we need to be nearby to care and support him. I started that company, and then a bit later, got an offer for it to be acquired by Google in 2004. They were in Mountain View, and they required that I be in the office 4 days a week. At the time, I had 2 little girls. I think they were probably 7 and 10 years old, and I didn't wanna be away from them every week. So how do I get to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, which is like 100 miles away, and get home for dinner every night on time and still be there to support my father-in-law and my daughters. And I looked at things like hydrogen powered cars. At the time, they were starting to do carpool lanes and only certain cars could be in those lanes. And looked at all the compressed natural gas cars, train. None of them seemed to work. But one that did work that could work is plane. And I did the math, like how does this work economically? And it turns out at the time, a home in Sacramento was so much less expensive than a home in like Palo Alto or the Bay Area that a home plus a plane in Sacramento was cheaper than living there. So the last piece is, okay, I gotta learn to fly a plane. I naively thought at the time, how hard could that be? I didn't know I would soon be learning about lenticular clouds and mountain wave and all sorts of things I never considered. I just thought it was like a more complicated car. I didn't realize all the weather things you have to worry about and air rules and airspace rules and regulations. But anyways, that's what I did. It's again engineering approach to things. Have a problem, gotta get to Mountain View, be home by 6 p.m. How do I do this? Learn to fly a plane. It took about 10 months. In fact, I think 10 years ago, about now, I got my private license, and I've since flown about 4,500 hours. I discovered I loved it, so it's one of those things where it was invigorating to learn something new from scratch. I'd forgotten that. Like when you're in college, you're always learning, but you're under this pressure. It was joyful just to learn a new thing from scratch. And if you ever have time, just learn something new, like learn to cook. I don't know. I just always get a lot of joy out of that. Yeah, that's the story of how I came to become a pilot. And then I commuted every day back and forth in a plane to work.
I mean, I'm not encouraging all of the listeners to go and learn how to fly. I don't know that that's practical.
No, that's
But what
true.
I
That's true. It's a good
but what I
career though. Lots of need for pilots.
Right,
So,
right, yeah. I've met other folks who have a passion for flying, and so I know it can be a very fulfilling hobby. I know it takes a lot of hours, and so it's something that you have to feel really dedicated to. But what I think is, like, helpful for people who maybe even don't wanna learn to fly is the fact that it was such a innovative solution to the situation that you were in, Debbie, and I think, strangely enough, I've even had a conversation recently with someone where they thought they had like option A and option B. But actually, if they took a step back, there were a whole series of other options possible if they just took the time to sort of figure out what is the end game? And then how many different ways can I accomplish that? And kind of more of that outside the box thinking, more of that design thinking, which is probably where the engineering you is coming from. But for people who are in a situation where they're having to try to be a more creative thinker, do you have any recommendations in those situations from your experience, Debbie?
I'll start with what I think the problem is for most. It's that we have this filter that got built somewhere on our journeys into adulthood that tries to knock out anything that we might feel might be embarrassing to say or stupid or might make us look like open us to ridicule. And this filter is always blocking creative ideas. And so the first thing is to be mindful. Every time you hear yourself start to say, no, stop. Why are you doing that? What is the risk? Ideas are cheap. There are 80 different ideas. Yeah, a lot of them aren't going to be the best ideas, but that's the the key thing. One of the things I noticed when I was at Google in the early days and also at Facebook was this attitude that whatever solutions existed today were probably not the best ones and everything was open for being rebuilt. Like today, we don't think anything of how impressive Google is that you type in Britney Spears and you get Britney Spears back as the right Google result, which is what you really meant. That was someone just rethinking spell checking. Instead of trying to match letter by letter, they were just like, wait, we have lots of people searching for things, and then they click on Britney Spears. If we just connect these two pieces of information, we can have the best spell checker ever. And this happens in our daily lives all the time. There's, every day in your house, there's something like, I don't know, there's better ways to reheat pizza. Like you just have to be willing to try, okay with failure. And it's being mindful when you're hearing that voice that says, nah, that's gonna be really stupid. People are gonna laugh at you. Don't do it. That's the thing where it's like, okay, voice. I think I heard an author describe this as like tried to turn it into a cartoon and put it like in a part of her body. There's like, okay, a little cartoon, Yosemite Sam. I hear you. I'm not gonna listen to Yosemite Sam. Tried to take down the power of this character, this voice in our heads into this diminutive little cartoon that we could kind of laugh at. Oh, you're trying to stop me again. I see what you're doing, you rascally, rabbit or whatever. I'm going to try this anyways. So That's silly. But again, I'm trying to qualify my ideas like, oh, that's a really dumb idea, Debbie. I can't believe you just said that on a podcast. No, try it, then maybe it'll work. I don't know. But yeah, that's the thing. Is not be afraid to fail.
Now, you mentioned, Debbie, that when you learned to fly, it was sort of a practical solution, but that you learned to love it. And I know that we've had discussions about your experience flying, and you had mentioned to me that flying really provided perspective. And so I'd love if you could just talk a little bit about the philosophical side of your experience flying.
I mentioned I used to commute in the air. When you get up at, and I'd fly at about 6,000 feet, which is, so it's a mile high in the sky. When you get up at a mile high in the sky, a house looks about this big. And then you think about the people in the house, and they're like this teeny tiny little, for those who are just listening, like smaller than the tip of your fingernail big. So I'd finish their work and something frustrating had happened. I'd be amped about. I can't believe we're doing this stupid thing. Now I've got all this more work to do. I don't they know I'm lazy and I don't like when problems arise. So now I gotta go do work. And I'd be totally amped. And I get in my plane and I get up high and I'm looking down and I'm imagining in these houses people having little arguments about, what happened that day, and this person cut me off, and I see these little speck of cars, like, bumping up against each other on the highway. I'm like, "Oh, wow, my problem that seemed so big when I was in that big building in Menlo Park, in the grand scheme of things, is like this itty bitty little speck of a problem." I mean, I could deal with a problem that's that big if I just step back and look at it, right? It's not that's for me, there's always perspective. Like every time I got up in the sky and I just saw like horses running across the pasture, or I saw little teeny cars, I just think how small everything is in the grand scheme of things. And it's just, oh, I can tackle those problems. They aren't that big. It's just when I'm in it, it looks big. But when I step out, how most of the universe sees us is very small.
I've never flown a plane. I mean, I've been in airplanes, on trips, big airplanes, but perspective, I think, can be gained from so many things that we forget about. And for me last year, that was actually a boat trip where I saw dolphins in the wild, and there were like thousands of dolphins. And I just remembered sort of tearing up, at the beauty of nature, but also everything feels so different when you like bump it up against something impactful. And so in your instance, it was like the size of things. And I think at that time when I saw these dolphins, for me, it was like the beauty of things, just like everyday, quiet, still, easy things, and just how beautiful they could be in that moment. And so I find those moments really profound. And I can only imagine, that experience for you flying.
I think there's another way you can use perspective without being a pilot, and that is looking back at time. If you have children, you can watch your child when they're like, 5 years old, and they come home from kindergarten. There's some great trauma about lunch or something. And as an adult, you kind of like, this problem is not that big a deal. Why are you on the ground in a meltdown mode over, maybe it's a 3-year-old, it's like the ice cream fell off the cone. It's like a total trauma. And if you think about your own life and look back to when you were 4 or 5, and those problems at that time that seemed so big, now when you move way forward and you look backwards, you're like, it wasn't that big a deal. And so, and you can keep rolling forward. You can look at yeah, I can remember when I was dating in high school and I just felt so inadequate. And I look back and said, well, that was not that big a deal. Well, you can think about where you are now. The things now that seem so big, maybe 20 years from now aren't going to seem that big anymore. Right. So that's another way I try to get some perspective on things. I'm not trying to turn it into like, it doesn't matter. I'm turning it more into this is a manageable problem. It's not an insurmountable thing. I don't know yet how I'm gonna solve it. I don't know how I'm gonna get through it. Might involve a lot of friends and tears, but I know I can get through it. I've gotten through a lot of other things that seemed big at the time.
Do think there's comfort in that. And I know with a lot of folks right now who are experiencing layoffs, there've been a lot of layoffs in honestly, the last few years, but this last year seems particularly aggressive. And for those folks who are, in that process, I think for many, it feels very overwhelming in the moment. But if you can take a step back and kind of consider your work history and other experiences that you've had, you're likely to recognize that you've looked for jobs before, you've been hired before, you've climbed the corporate ladder in different organizations. And so you do have the skill set and the things necessary. And I just bring that up because I do think it aligns. It does align with what you're saying, Debbie, from that perspective. And it's something that I think for the listeners is really applicable, like in this moment, to be able to find those moments of perspective.
When I say this, I'm not saying to you, to each listener, your problems don't matter and they're not that big. That's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about this more as a tool to work through your problems. I had a moment, like 8 years ago, where if I took the people who I believe loved me unconditionally, nearly all of them had abandoned me. I found myself on a couch on Christmas with no one around but my dog, like hurting, like my insides were just hurting. I have never cried so hard and so violently. And there's no way I would ever say that problem was not big in that moment. I had to go from, I always like to plan way ahead. I'm thinking about 10 years from now. At that moment, I was down to, I'm going to work on the next 5 minutes because I actually can't cope with 6 minutes. And if I get to the next 5 minutes, then I'll worry about the next 5 minutes after that. So I do want to make it very clear. I'm not saying being laid off is not that big a deal. It is, because it's very uncertain. You're looking at your family or your loved ones or whoever else might be dependent on you or just yourself. And am I going to pay the bills? Am I going to have to? These are big problems. I'm not I'm talking about tools for managing those problems, not trying to minimize the problems.
For what it's worth, Debbie, I wasn't trying to imply that you were like diminishing the layoffs. I just meant that I think these tools are applicable for a lot of folks right now who are dealing with some really hard stuff. And I think it's interesting because at the top we were sort of alluding to that feeling of like rejection. And I know that that's a big part of the layoff process too, is like feeling like I've been rejected. I don't know how I'm going to take care of my family. You know, let's be honest, job searching sucks. Like there's no great like job search process. It's just a, it's this thing that we have to do. But I do think when we like need that relief, right? Or that pressure or a little bit of reassurance that it's all going to be okay, many of us can look at our histories and say, I've overcome bigger challenges. I've done this before. These things always have a way of working out, and it won't necessarily fix that immediate issue, but it could give some mental relief. It could give some mental relief, I think.
Totally. I agree with that.
So I want to make a hard segue here because we've talked quite a bit about like work history and it's very clear that you've had a very successful career, but you're making a pretty big pivot right now. So you're going to return to school for an MFA in writing, which I think is a kind of a non-traditional choice. Most people go to school the beginning of their career and then they have a career and then they retire. But you had a career and now you're like, I'm going to go back to school. And so what inspired you to take this path now? And how are you hoping that this degree is going to shape your future? You said you like to plan 10 years in advance. How is going and getting this MFA going to shape your future both personally and professionally?
At my core, I see myself as a builder. I have to be creating things. One of the things that's involved when you lead large teams, like in a tech company where I was at, is my time is really determined by the hours of the company, the hours of the individuals that I'm working with. And one of the things I hope to have in my next chapter is more control over my time. So if a friend is in need, I could go do that. If I want to go golfing, I could go do that. And so I was looking at how do I keep building, but in a more flexible way. And writing is one of those areas where you can write anywhere, anytime. I could write just 2 hours every morning. It involves maybe an editor, maybe an agent if you get successful enough. And so that's what drew me to writing. I've always had a passion for, I think it's ingrained in humans. I don't think it's unique to say a passion for story. I've written a novel before, never was published, but I enjoyed the process of doing that. And so then I wanted to do writing. Again, I kind of applied my how I became an engineer, which I first learned the basics of computer science, the foundational elements. And I noticed that that served me well my entire career, even as technology changed from a big mainframe computer to computers on your wrist. And So I feel like an MFA will give me a chance to learn the fundamentals, the technical details, the foundational elements of the language of English, how it's used to construct great story. And if I have that foundation, then I'm going to be able to hopefully instinctively use those tools to craft a story that engages and grabs the reader. We'll see if that works out. Maybe I will get accepted in the programs. They're hard to get into. And if that's okay, I've lost some power there. The school rejected me. I'll find another path to accomplishing that goal.
I got kind of giddy while you were talking, Debbie, because often in these conversations with people who have taken non-traditional choices or maybe had non-linear career paths, we talk about transferable skills. And when you were talking about your process, your approach to learning to be an engineer and how that could then be applied to learning writing as a craft, I got giddy because it's a transferable skill, but it's a different kind. It's not a one-to-one the way that we normally talk about transferable skills. These are all just tools, right, that people can put in their toolboxes, and it's ways of thinking about the things that we've accomplished and the things that we still want to accomplish. And how do we connect those things? What are the themes? What are the trends? What are the tools in our past toolboxes that we can use again? And so I don't know. I get nerdy sometimes, and I got really excited when you were talking about that because it was like I was like transferable skills.
Yeah, I think that's right. You had asked about 10 years from now. Another factor in deciding writing it was what are the limitations I could face when I'm 70 or 80 or 90? And who knows how my physical body will hold up. But writing, particularly improving skills around the accessibility things that have been occurring with computers where you can more and more use voice. I feel like a writing, as long as I have a brain that's crisp and able to construct story, I'm going to be able to find a way to do that late, like for another half century. No, I want to build until I can't build.
When you think about what you're most excited about through this journey of writing, and you did mention, that it's part of it's about empathy and inspiration, and then the building of a story. Like, what are you most excited about as you look to start crafting stories?
One of the things I discovered as I coached a number of people over the years with a wide variety of backgrounds and different types of disabilities and capabilities is this true story, the full story of each person so much richer than you ever see on the surface. And drawing that out, I think, is so powerful. Like when I hear a story about someone who grew up in a completely different context than I was in, maybe it's someone who grew up in Peru, or maybe someone who's older and grew up during the Vietnam War in Vietnam and how it was like for their family. These stories just they change these abstract notions of war or poverty or strife or discrimination to very things that are real. You can never totally be in those shoes, but you can have a deeper appreciation, understanding. And I think it makes us closer. It's hard. I rarely hear the story where someone learns someone else's full story who's truly trying to listen and understand, and at the end feels less disconnected with that person than before. Vulnerability to me is like a super glue. When we're vulnerable with each other and willing to listen, um, it creates stronger bonds, and so that's really what motivates me. A selfish part of that is then I also learn a lot, and I often surprised at things that I assume to be universal are not at all universal. And I love the notion of learning about other cultures and histories and stories. So there's a selfish side of it as well.
Now, before we close out the show, I do have a question that relates to some of your hobbies. And this is a bit anecdotal, not really on theme, maybe for what we've been talking about. But you have learned to scuba dive, you've learned to pole dance. I'm just wondering, are there any new and exciting skills that you plan to add to your resume on the horizon?
I learned pickleball this last year. That was something I'd never done before. And did curling for the first time in December. The curling was just a friend. Hey, there's curling in our city here. Do you want to go curl? Oh, yeah, sure. And so some of it's just being open to the possibility. I think for me, it's just being open to think if someone today said, "Hey, you wanna go learn how to drive a steamroller?" I'd be like, "Oh, yeah, let's sure, like, let's go see what it's like to drive a big steamroller. I crush some things." So, yeah, I don't have a specific thing in mind, but I hope I'll be sad if I don't pick up something new in the coming year.
Debbie, how does that connect to this concept of power? Because as we were talking, even in the topics that weren't directly related to power, there was this tie back consistently to owning your power, holding your power, reestablishing your power. And so when you're learning new skills, is there any connection to this concept of power?
Interesting question. I guess what I would say is each time I learn one of these new skills, I learn something about particularly the ones that are physical, like curling. I learned something about my body, like a limitation somewhere. Like in curling, you're essentially doing a lunge when you let go of the stone. And I was like, oh, if I work on my lunges, I can continue to have strength in a way that will enable me to do other activities that, hopefully later in life that involve getting low and, using a lot of core. I think maybe that's it, is I get to see how far my brain will stretch. Pole dancing, I'm not talking about the sexual side of pole dancing and the stilettos and all that, but just the skill of pole dancing is really, to me, it's like a meditative activity. You have to be very present and focused in that moment. So it's some power over your mind because you can't be drifting when you're thinking about doing an inversion and your whole being is your neck is being protected by your ankles hanging above you. But then you have to learn a lot of body control. When you learn body control, then you're able to use that in different types of dances or in different types of activities. And I think that's important. Time works against us in our physical selves. And I find if I keep finding ways to keep it active and keep it used in ways different than what it's been used, I hope it'll last me a bit longer and be high functioning a bit longer.
The lesson that I sort of interpreted from what you just said, Debbie, is that self awareness, both physical and mental self awareness, is a form of power.
The other thing about activities like this, when someone says you want to go do blah, I think that's another place where your brain will say, "No, you're a 50-year-old. You don't pole dance. Why? You'd look ridiculous. You would get hurt. Why would your brain is protecting you?" But I think having a discipline of breaking through those protections, I think it's another form of helping to manage and grow and manage your ability to grow and to control those voices that want to keep you from getting outside your protective shell.
So, Debbie, we're coming at the end, and I love to end every episode with the same question. So, if somebody said this was too long, I did not listen, what's the one thing you'd want them to take away from this conversation?
The one thing I would say take away is be mindful of wherever barriers are keeping you from doing something. Wherever you hear the voice that says no, challenge it. It's there to keep us safe, but just be very mindful when you're stopping for really nothing more than a fear of your ego being harmed or some other risk like that. That's probably where there's a growth edge there that you can, in challenging it, you'll probably be able to accomplish more things than you thought you could.
I've really appreciated this conversation, Debbie. It's interesting to have a conversation about power that doesn't feel toxic. And so I really appreciate that we could have a conversation about power, about self advocacy, about self awareness in a way that people can make intentionally authentic to themselves. And it's a really meaningful conversation, and I think it's a very timely one. So thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for the time. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And I think you put that well. Power can be used to dominate, or it can be used to help others to grow yourself and to have more influence and have more positive impact on everyone around you.